In mainstream clinical psychology, the concept of resilience is widely celebrated. We define it as the ability to bounce back from adversity, to endure hardship, and ultimately adapt to difficult circumstances. But when applied to minoritized and indigenous populations, this universally championed construct falls apart. The breakdown happens because clinical psychology relies on a hidden structural mechanism known as zero-point epistemology. Zero-point epistemology assumes psychological models built in Western contexts represent an objective baseline for human experience, an invisible origin point on the map of human behavior. From this unexamined vantage point, the discipline evaluates the world while assuming its own perspective is detached and neutral. Treating one specific cultural lens as a universal baseline has serious clinical consequences, methods of survival and community organization, not just as cultural differences, but as clinical deficits. Epistemicide, the systematic suppression and erasure of indigenous knowledge systems, historically established this Western baseline, overriding diverse ways of knowing with colonial power structures. Long after formal geopolitical independence, the power dynamics of that colonial era persist in modern universities, research funding, and clinical hierarchies. Current academic efforts to fix this often focus on inclusion, introducing broader sample sizes into existing Western experimental designs. That fails to correct the root epistemological bias. Applying conventional resilience within the system pressures individuals to adapt to and quietly survive within structures that are often the source of their distress. Behavioral health equity rests on epistemic disobedience, the foundational refusal to reproduce psychological frameworks that continue to erase the realities of colonization. True equity requires the field to move past the demand for simple adaptation and adopt a different structural approach. Decolonial and liberation psychologies offer a replacement for conventional resilience. They use a framework called Health Survivance. The term is a portmanteau of survival and resistance. Rather than a passive inward bounce, it is a force that pushes outward. Survivance is defined as an active sense of presence. It explicitly renounces narratives of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. This shift in terminology changes the clinical objective. It removes the focus from enduring adversity and replaces it with the active persistence of indigenous peoples. The clinical subject is no longer viewed as a victim managing trauma, but as an active agent of cultural continuity. Decolonial scholars separate survivance from conventional resilience across 4 distinct areas of differentiation. This chart outlines the 4 pillars. The first is resistance versus adaptation. Survivance prioritizes active resistance to unjust societal arrangements. Conventional resilience promotes adaptation within the existing status quo. The second pillar is the temporal arc. Survivance expands the timeframe of healing entirely. It utilizes the 7 generations principle, an inclusive span of past ancestors and future generations. Conventional resilience strictly limits its focus to the individual lifespan. Together, these first 2 pillars expand the scope of psychological healing from a single, isolated person to a generational continuum pushing against systemic injustice. The third pillar shifts the clinical focus from personal adaptation to community persistence, emphasizing collective well-being and cultural relationships over individual coping skills. This communal focus creates friction with standard Western psychological ethics. Western models often pathologize multiple relationships to maintain strict boundaries, directly conflicting with the need for healers and elders who are deeply integrated into their communities. The fourth and final pillar is the refusal of victimization. Resilience often relies on an enduring consciousness of trauma and vulnerability. Survivance actively refuses those identities, emphasizing a thriving presence, joy, and sovereignty. These 4 pillars dismantle the premise that clinical success means quietly enduring suffering within a broken system. To apply this framework, decolonial psychologies rely on 3 reclamation pillars: love, wisdom, and healing. Healing within this paradigm requires a critical internal process called neurodecolonization. Neurodecolonization involves unlearning separability, the socially imposed alienation that distances humans from the earth. It reestablishes the intricate biological connections between all living entities. The process uses culture as treatment, utilizing traditional practices like food sovereignty and land-based reconciliation as primary clinical interventions. This approach focuses on the literal restructuring of the brain's relationship to the community and the physical environment, moving past the limitations of individualistic therapy. Bringing the Health Survivance framework into the mainstream requires overcoming significant structural barriers, specifically the diagnostic tools that gatekeep behavioral health equity. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, serves as the ultimate artifact of zero-point epistemology. Decolonial scholars point out that the DSM frequently categorizes and pathologizes human behavior based on the narrow logic of Eurocentrism and capitalism. The radical proposal is to turn the DSM on its head, using the diagnostic framework to highlight the systemic pathologies of the colonizer rather than assigning blame to the colonized. True epistemic disobedience requires dismantling the very tools that force healers from the global majority to perform invisible labor against white supremacist hegemony just to care for their patients. Replacing these Western diagnostics means the field must embrace alternative, place-based methodologies in its research. Practices like Kaupapa Maori and the Indaba Collective offer approaches that view humans not as isolated subjects, but as woven into a complex world of both human and non-human entities. This epistemological shift in academia must connect to physical reality. The discipline of psychology must stand in solidarity with concrete political actions like the land back movement. This structural transformation is often described as a Sankofa journey. It is the act of looking backward to reclaim ancestral wisdom in order to project forward into a new future of collective agency. Behavioral health equity is impossible inside the colonially defined systems that historically justified subjugation in the first place. By shifting the objective from passive adaptation to intergenerational resistance, decolonial psychology provides a blueprint for a clinical science that respects the full plurality of human history.